I'm Deacon Anthony. My parish is Patronage of the Mother of God in Baltimore, Maryland. I'll be speaking about the church calendar, theology, and technology, and how that relates to the date of Pascha. There are two acknowledgments I'm happy to make. One is Lector Jack Fiegel, colleague and friend, and to acknowledge his efforts for Christian unity, especially through the Orientali Lumen conferences, and for giving me the opportunity to address this calendar issue. And that made me think back to that first conference 26 years ago, and I have this icon card given by Bishop Sevalot of happy memory after he celebrated liturgy at the Basilica of the National Shrine. And it shows the wear and tear of my having it with me in my wallet for these past 26 years. The next acknowledgement is the Byzantine Forum at bizcat.org, and another colleague and friend, John Vernosky, who owns and operates this, and his ministry, allowing this as a platform for a dialogue between all faiths, but especially Catholic Orthodox dialogue, and in particular Eastern Catholic and Orthodox. And my first post on the calendar was back in 2007, responding to Father Serge Kelleher of blessed memory, who was passionate on the issue of the calendar. I want to highlight the Aleppo Agreed Statement, 1977, of the World Council of Churches, since it provides the foundation and the context for my presentation. Well, back in August of last year, I became aware of the editorial by Archbishop Job, in which he asks us to reflect on what visible unity means, and offers us a challenge and a initiative to educate ourselves on the necessity of calendar reform and of a common day of Pascha. And I want to review the background and fundamentals for that reflection. Nicaea, AD 325. And this is a fortuitous and auspicious time today for us, because we who are on the Gregorian calendar have just finished the commemoration of the Sunday of the Fathers of the First Ecumenical Council, and those on the Julian will be following us this Sunday. This is a church bulletin, and what I've done is I've translated what's on this scroll, and it says, agree on a common date already. We did not get any canons or norms from Nicaea. What it did give us was a mandate for a common date of Pascha, and a theology of Sunday as the preeminent day of the resurrection. Of course, the scroll is the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed of some years in the future. However, it is the faith that we have within us, the common faith that is within us. God is in the details. I'm a firm believer of that. I think my presentation will demonstrate that, fittingly said by an architect. Mies van der Rohe also said that the less is more. I think I have failed him in that respect. But there are things about the calendar that we should consider, and we should think about how it is constructed, how it works, how it impacts on our spiritual life. The development of the church calendar I see proceeding in three basic phases. One is the biblical, to ante-Nicene times. A second is the Nicaea, patristic, medieval, up to the Renaissance. And that is something we are presently using today. And then there's a new proposal, and that is the modern, detailed, scientific, and astronomical. and also consideration of just a fixed date for Pascha. Roughly corresponding to the three phases are models and methods. And I want to emphasize that these are all models of one degree or another and are all based on observation. The first is just phenomena, which is calendar defining, based on empirical evidence. It's the biblical approach. The key word is natural, senses and appearances. A second phase, a second method or model, is the calendar, which is constructed as a tool to mimic nature. And examples are the Julian, Gregorian, Hebrew, and Revised Julian calendar. The key word here is arithmetic. It's the use of whole numbers and fractions, average values, tables, algorithms, rules and formulas, programs. And this is starting to sound scientific. And in fact, there was a good deal of science involved for its time. Last is the astronomical, which is, again, calendar independent, kind of like that first phase. And it is scientific based on first principles of physics. And the key word is calculus, numerical integration of many-bodied, massively coupled differential equations, gravitational and other fundamental forces and interactions. And so if there's an image to go along with these three models, and this one would be the domestic hearth. This one is the kitchen stove. And this one is the industrial blast furnace. Aleppo 1997 statement of the many good things and good points in that statement, good theology. Our focus is on the formula to maintain the Nicaean norm that Easter should fall on the Sunday following the first vernal full moon. We'll be taking a closer look at that. And the proposal is to calculate the astronomical data by the most accurate possible scientific means. And a reminder that that's calendar independent. The calendar is implied but not explicit in making that calculation. However, we do need to fix it in time, the results. And so the question is then, how is that reported on what calendar, on whose calendar? So the theology and technology go in hand, but first we're going to take a more detailed look of the theology. And that is, in particular, again from following the Aleppo statement, that it is the intimate connection between the biblical Passover and passages from the Old Testament and the Christian celebration of Christ our Pascha. And so we will be looking at these passages and some others as they are phenomena and calendar defining based on our natural senses and appearances. There's a way I would like us to proceed, hermeneutic, that is to read as a Jew, interpret as a Christian, because we both have the common Old Testament prototype, but only Christians have the archetype. On the way to Emmaus, Jesus, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, interpreted to the disciples and in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. And here I give the original words, which I like to do because I distrust translations, and so this is a way of making sure that the translation is kept honest. Putting it another way, all sacred scripture is but one book, and that one book is Christ, because all divine scripture speaks of Christ, and all divine scripture is fulfilled in Christ. I just like that so much I had to put it in. It's by a Latin theologian from our Western Church, U of St. Victor. So the development of the biblical Hebrew calendar. This is a standard translation, and it's that first verse that was given in the Aleppo statement. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread, and so until the 21st day of the month at evening. But what's the tie-in with the Passover? And if we look a few passages down, we see, select the lambs for yourselves according to your families and kill the Passover lamb. Well, that was a standard translation, but let's now do a literal rendering using the idiom of the Hebrew. In the first one, nothing about a month, on the 14th day, for the moon, again, not month necessarily, and that word is Kodesh, something to remember. At evening, you shall eat unleavens. No explicit word, lechem, for bread, but presuming we're eating it, the unleavens that way. And so until the 21st for the moon at evening. And then again, we follow it down and kill the Passover, literally sacrifice the Passover. And something will be coming up later on, just to make a point of it, that at least Ralph's Septuagint does not say anything about the moon. It really more a sense of a month. And in fact, this Hebrew, Kodesh, does imply that it's related to a calendar, a timing. So what is this moon, the lunar month, the 14th day of the moon? And of course, we are somewhat biased because we have a solar calendar. And so the moon gets secondary treatment. Sometimes they're found on the dates or down like this. And so we look over here, and the 13th is signed for the new moon. Well, that would be occurring over here. And I'm looking at March in particular, because that's one of the times for around the time of the Passover, the Easter celebration. But if we see that the new moon is on the 13th, and we want to find the next new moon, well, we have to look over here in April on the 12th. And so to look at the lunar month, we need to piece together the two sections of March and April. And doing that, what we get is what I'm calling the astronomical lunar March of 2021. I use that date because it illustrated this idea of putting together two months of the calendar. And so we have here the new moon with this symbol, and the full moon is here on the 28th, and then the next new moon, the next lunar month, would start here on April 12th. And here's the sign Aries, which is a standard from ancient antiquity considerations, but it's a standard sign for the equinox. And this is for the civil calendar, which is the Gregorian calendar. And also to recall here that we call calendars which require observation the empirical calendar, like the Hebrew, and the instant when, for example, a new moon is first observed depends upon latitude, longitude of the observer, to say nothing of the state of the weather. So it's a case where there's a lot of other factors that come into play. And while this is the first day of the astronomical lunar month, it may not in fact be the first day that will be observed. And so if that first day, in this particular case here, if we just can't use these numbers, this is the first day of the moon of the month. In this particular case, the full moon is occurring on the 16th day of the moon. But if, and of course, can't be observed. It's dark, very hard to observe. We might be able to observe it here or here, and that would then push the 14th day to a different date. It turns out that April 2022 is very convenient for us because the new moon was on the very first day of the month, and so April 2022 looks like a lunar month. And so here's the new moon. Now, of course, that's dark, very hard to observe. And in fact, for the biblical calendar, which was to find that new moon for the 14th day of the moon, was done by official observers who went out at the evening, at sunset, and looked to the west and tried to observe the moon. And so maybe they saw it. They would not see it on this day, more than likely, because it's dark. And so they may see this one. There's a little bit of sliver there, but maybe the weather conditions were bad. Or so maybe certainly this one. They would see it and observe it, and this would become then Luna 1, the first day of the month. And so in that particular case, well, if this is the first day for the astronomical, if the full moon is on the 16th, we would advance 2 more days. Here's a 14th day. That would actually put the 14th day of the moon, as we heard in that passage from Exodus, on the very day of the full moon. But it need not be the case. But here we can see that if we were to follow that, either one of those two conventions, this would be the 14th day of the moon or the full moon for Lippo. And so the next Sunday, Bango, is Pascha, the 17th, which in fact was celebrated by the Gregorian, those who were on the Gregorian calendar. And so this is the Paschal full moon. Now, a Paschal moon, the Paschal month, how do we know that that's the case? Well, we need to look back and we need to find the equinox. And here again is the standard symbol for the equinox, Aries. And it occurred on the 20th of March. So here we have the 20th. And the full moon for that month, 14th day of the moon, was on the 16th. So that moon didn't make it as being the vernal moon. We had to wait for the next one to come along, and that's this one, our month of April. I just realized I pointed to the wrong month. So let's do this the right way. And what we want to look at is that the equinox is occurring on March 20th, or equinox is on March 20th. However, the full moon is on the 18th, and so it's the same idea that this moon would not have made it as being the vernal moon. Let's take a look at some designations for the moon in the Greek and the Greek Septuagint and the Masoretic text, the Hebrew. And the 2 Psalm verses gives us some vocabulary. One is Psalm 80, 81, which I don't think we use that in the liturgy. It certainly is, except for reading the Psalter. But it says, blow the trumpet, the shofar, the ram's horn at the new moon, and that's our word, Kodesh, and at the full moon. Now here's a different word for our feast day. So the Kodesh is the lunar month, referring to the moon, the new moon. This word, Kesa, is means a seat of honor, and or something that's easily recognizable, clear and distinct. And so from that, the sense and the context, the sense of the full moon is inferred. But it doesn't occur in that respect, in that sense, very often in Scripture. There's this psalm verse in Proverbs, which verse is not even in the Septuagint. And then in the New Testament and Revelation, there is the He Selene Hole, which can mean the whole moon, or it can mean, maybe it does mean the full moon. I'm a little shy about the pronunciation of the Greek because many years ago, I was taking a course. It was a theology course with speaking with an older Greek gentleman who was taking it, and he told me that he would cringe every time the teacher would pronounce something in Greek. But well, that's the way I learned it. So the next verse, though, here is 103. It's very familiar to us from Vespers and Prokimena, communion hymns. He has made the moon a different word now, Yareka, for the appointed times the sun knows its entrance. And this sense of the moon refers to the moon as an object, and more in the sense, I think, of Selene. And then, of course, the appointed times are something which is not necessarily a chronology, but they're like the right time. And in the Septuagint, we find Ace Karus. Full moon is hardly mentioned explicitly in Scripture, and only by virtue of its context. It does not define or designate the moon or the month. Why? It wasn't that important because, for one thing, it's not an on-off event like the new moon, where here for the new moon, you're looking at the dark and all of a sudden you're looking for that little sliver of light. For the full moon, you're not quite really sure it's full necessarily until it's past. And also the new moon gives 14 days to prepare for the feast. And the Christian liturgy would expand that to even 40 days and even more requirement. And so perhaps that was pointing towards even a further reason for the need for a computus and predictability. Well, continuing now, building up the Hebrew calendar with verses, Leviticus, these two, Leviticus and Numbers, this one will be considered later. That don't tell us much more than we've already heard before. I use this opportunity to designate, of course, that I'm designating the Tetragrammaton, the divine name, the Old Testament divine name, as Yahweh. And now, in these verses, we begin to build up the concept of the year. This moon, Kodesh, again, shall be for you the head, the beginning of moons. So it stands at the beginning, the chief, this to you for the moons of the year. And now the moons are starting to be assembled in a sense of a cycle, a yearly cycle. And again, another reason for that, having that new moon, is that there's another designation on the 10th day. That's where one of the flock would be selected. And guard them until the 14th of the moon again, slaughter them, the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel, between the evenings. And there's a lot of different ways that's translated. So it's kind of an enigmatic phrase, and bears some more looking into as to when that actually is meant to occur. And now we come to the verses that fix that chief month at a time, and is designated by the new barley. The Aviv refers to new barley. So when the new barley is going to be observed, that's when you want to have designate this as that chief moon, because observe that moon and keep the Passover to Yahweh your God in the moon of Aviv, because in that moon your God brought you out of Egypt by night. You shall slaughter the Pesach. And this verse, I just included it because there's a sense of remembering something very important for us. And no leavens, and the moon of Aviv again. And keep the Feast of Unleavens, again, very important timing here for that feast. As I commanded you, eat unleavens for 7 days at the appointed time again in the moon of Aviv. And Aviv in modern Hebrew actually means spring. Some of us are old enough to remember and actually learned that the capital of the state of Israel, officially, at the time, wasn't Jerusalem, but it was the modern city of Tel Aviv, which is the hill of spring. And now going back to that verse from Leviticus, where it didn't give us much more than we had already heard about the 14th of the moon. But now, if we read on further, it ties in with yet another feast, and that is the Omer, the sheaves, and of the harvest. We call this first fruits, the first of the harvest. And so it's important in the sense to get that barley harvest timing right, because you need to. There was this requirement for this other feast, and it's not placed exactly. It's not an absolute timing for it that's given. It's a relative timing. It's on the morrow after the Sabbath. But what Sabbath is that? Some determination has to be made. Then count from the morrow after the Sabbath 7 Sabbaths. And this is the Sabbath and seven have a alliteration in the Hebrew. Sheva, Shavaot. And then 50, Pentekonta, to the morrow after the seventh Sabbath, 7 weeks, count them, it becomes the Feast of Weeks, literally, which is a Shavuot, literally the Feast of Weeks to Yahweh your God. And so what we have to do now is to assemble all those verses and to decide on some timings, because it's not perfectly clear, especially with regard to the New Testament timings, and then to assemble the Paschal lunar calendar. Here then is the result from assembling all those verses. The moon of Nisan, Aviv, for the time of the Passion. Nisan is the Babylonian name that is used probably more often in the Hebrew. And so it's the month of Nisan, or the month of Aviv. And just to run down what all the rows are, well, I try to put it in a liturgical context, and actually I use the liturgy oftentimes as a guide for determining the timing when there was some question. And so it was the timing that best fits in with our liturgical sense, and still remains true to the words of the scripture. So here in the light blue are the liturgical timings. Then there's the civil days. They're important. And then the days of the week, the days of creation and how they're numbered. The first day of the week be the first day of creation. The seventh is the Sabbath. I just did this little schematic here for evening and morning to get the timings right, because let's go over here and take a look at a larger day. So, of course, all the days are equal. I just compressed the ones that are just fillers, and since this is a calendar, I don't want to leave any of the days out. But for instance, here this would be midnight, and it's the beginning of the civil day, and that goes to the next midnight. However, it overlaps the biblical day, which is starting at the evening, and then goes through dawn, and then back to the next evening. And of course, here is the star of the show, the day of the moon, the first day of the moon, designated here. And then here is our 14th day that we heard so much about in the scripture passages. And now adding those verses from Leviticus about the Omer, and that's that counting the 50 days. So here I've placed it where it is liturgically for us, and I think oftentimes it's placed here also by the Jewish observance. But it's I lose the cursor sometimes. It's remember the morrow? It was on the morrow after the Sabbath. Start counting the Omer, which is the sheaves probably of the barley that was identified, and then we start to count count the 7 weeks, and then the 49 days plus the one morrow to get back to the day after the Sabbath. And of course, that's for us the Pentecost, where in the Acts of the Apostles, everybody, it was a big feast for the Hebrews, so that's why all those people were assembled there at the time of Pentecost. And also there's the Feast of the Unleavens, which begin after the 14th day, and then they are counted for 7 days, the Unleavens. Just to point out a few more things, one is that on this 10th day was when the lamb is selected, and that corresponds roughly to, it's the Sunday before Pascha. So this is Flowery Sunday. There we go, right up there. And liturgically, we don't make anything of that. That's not important for us, as far as I know. It's interesting though, on the if you search the web, this is this was when the lambs were selected, and it's Palm Sunday. It's a very something very prominent for what I would call non-liturgical Christians. And another one is here mid Pentecost, which we of course is on the Wednesday. Following that down, this the water themes for this, interestingly, probably come from the feast of the in the autumn, Sukkot, the tabernacles, where there was a water ritual that was very unique. May come from that, but anyway, we celebrate it here as the middle of the feast, so it's between the right days, 25, 26, on a Wednesday. The other thing is that the Passover, the Pesach, and the unleavened bread really become conflated. We think of them as one feast, and it is sometimes pointed out, and I think that the sense that I got from going through those passages is that the Passover really is a very narrow observance right here. It's the killing of the Pesach and the slaughtering of the Passover and the eating of the meal. And then that gets linked in with the sense of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, which does go for the 7 days. But we tend to, they tend to run together. And the other thing is that liturgically, we observe distinct elements. And that's nice because we compartmentalize for the sake of our liturgical observances. So Thursday is the Lord's Supper, and then there's the Friday crucifixion and burial. However, if you look at the biblical day, those all take place on one day: the meal, the crucifixion, and the burial. And so there's a sense of a uniting in temporal terms of these events that are so vital and important for us as Christians. And this is then for the Nicaean norm. That is just one scenario. For the 14th day of the moon can occur on any day of the week for the various years. And there are then 7 scenarios for Easter, Pascha. This is the historical, the moon of the gospel, but it's just one of them. And this is only duplicated exactly timing-wise on for one set of 7 circumstances. But that's the beauty of the norm that was set by the council, or developed as a result of it, is that it adapts the scenario for every succeeding generation of Christian. And so we all get to experience the same event, even though it cannot be experienced exactly in this chronological sense. So someone posed this to me. This is a case study, and said, "Well, here, let's go back to take a look at April, and if here's the full moon, and if you now celebrate Pascha on the 17th, as the norm appears to say, you don't have enough time for all the those events, the crucifixion, the supper, the crucifixion, and burial. So doesn't it make more sense to wait that week so you can observe those things and celebrate here on the 24th, where the Orthodox celebrate? Of course, it's nowhere as near the full moon, but it makes sense. And so often when arguments are presented, they're kind of the common sense arguments, and of course it's this, of course it's that, and when you delve into the actual facts and what is proposed, well, that is not the case. And so, as part of this case study, there is a comment by someone who worked on the Computus very vigorously back in the 8th century, Venerable Bede, who was Computist and historian. And this goes something that occurred on that forum that I referred to, and Mockingbird is the screen name. I've asked for his actual name and haven't heard back from him yet. But he pointed out when I presented that previous scenario, and he pointed this out. He says Bede even argues that it would be ideal if Easter could always occur on the 15th, and not on the previous timing. Let me go back where it is on the 17th day. So he's saying, Bede is saying, he studied this and worked on it, because he says the same 14th day of the moon to fall on Saturday every year. That's what would be ideal. And because he wants to observe the lawful time and the precepts of the law that we just went through. Because these computers, they were looking at those Old Testament verses pretty closely. 14th day of the moon of the first month, again the Aviv at sunset. So he's hitting all the high marks here. 15th, and then at break of the day of the 15th day of the moon, entering the first day of unleavened bread, and for the 7 appointed days of the festival, the leaving of the 21st day in this first month. So for him, this is the first month again. So what he's saying is, I'll give you a little preview there. What he's saying is that this 14th, he wants it to be on the Sabbath. And so let's do that. And just move that over. The 14th day occurring on the Sabbath. And what is to be gained by all of this? Well, when you do that, look what happens. The first day of Omer, meal, crucifixion, burial, first day of unleavened bread, the Pesach meal, the 15th day, first fruits, or he said unleavened bread, Pascha, all line up. And so for him, the liturgical alignment, when the 14th day of the moon is on a Saturday, produced this ideal vision of unity of all of these feasts and observances and appointed times. So the point is that, of course, all the 7 possible Luna 14 scenarios, Luna 14 can be on a Sunday through Saturday, are equally valid and liturgically complete. Let's consider some patristic comments. Actually, it's going to turn out just to be one comment, because the one of the two that I selected, and it really deserves much greater scrutiny, but of the two selected, the one of them was incorrectly referenced, and then it was very spurious, it seemed to me. But to put this in context, we're here at this second step, the second phase of the Computus, the Paschalion, Nicaea, and to the present in terms of what we are using, but looking at the patristic comments that were made with regard to how we should observe the timing for Easter, for the Pascha. And this one is Chrysostom, Paschal Homily 7, and it's given in this very fine paper. It was published in St. Vladimir's Theological Quarterly, Paschalion, an Icon of Time. I recommend it. And he presents two references, one from Chrysostom, one from Ambrose. I'm looking at this one from Chrysostom, and here's the page from the main, and this is, I think this is his, Campbell's translation. I didn't find it anyplace else. But it says, since we keep the first of time, spring, and the equinox, and after this, that's important, after this, the 14th of the moon, and together with these, the 3 days, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and lacking any of these at one time, it is impossible to fulfill the Pascha. And of course, this seems to say that the equinox and after this, if it means after the equinox, then that doesn't follow one of the norms, which interprets that as being on that that 14th day can occur after or on the equinox. The Greek, as I understand it, is that's the accusative. So after this is the correct translation. what I've done here is just to give you some sense of the importance of this, at least in this, even if it wasn't Chrysostom, it's certainly a commentator in early patristic times. This 14th day and the moon, and to color code them. And of course, you can't read any of this; it's too small. It's hard to read even when it's large, but it gives you a sense of how often he's talking about this. But something to note on every other page, it happened not to be on this one, is this Hesperia. So it's not even, so that's why that question mark came up there after Chrysostom. But it does present a sense of the way these writers were still looking at the, going back to the biblical terminology. And I remember I said it was that line from the Septuagint where I did this and I said, I'm going to now show how they took the text right from the Septuagint, the Greek text, but in fact that's not what the Septuagint has. It doesn't have Selene, it has Menos. Obviously this terminology is coming from some other place in this patristic commentary. And so now I'm going to leave behind the emphasis on the theology, but of course it gets carried along with us into consideration of the technology at that time of that second phase. And this is represented very nicely here from a webinar that was conducted in April on the common celebration of Pascha by Archbishop Job. And he shows here the old Paschalian table and how it was arranged and used. And he gives an example for calculating the date for Easter, for Pascha, and just using two simple arithmetic calculations. And something to point out from this, though, is this line here, which is these 19 numbers called the golden numbers, and they're going to figure very importantly in the Computus. And I also have here this box around the 22nd, because going back to that biblical commentary, in order for this to be Pascha, the 14th day has to have occurred on the 21st, which is that day of spring, not after, because then it would be pushed to the next day. So I believe I said the biblical commentary about this, but I meant the patristic commentary, which would not have allowed this date. But I think this is the only time this occurs in this table. But take a look at this table. It's really quite a feat, incredible. It's you have 19 possibilities here, and 7 categories here, and that's it, all in one. You want the date of Easter, Pascha, for any year. It's given in this very neat, handy table. If only it worked for more than a couple hundred years, it would have been wonderful. So that's the old Paschalion. And then what about the new? For some, the papal bull, Pope Gregory XIII, and for some, this is the date that lives in infamy. However, what I want to show here with the red is the mindset of the Western Church at this time, and that how steeped they are in that common sense of the Paschalion and Computus. And those times, I mean, we say it's kind of like the Wild West in that it wasn't this orderly progression of towards a common understanding of what the science was and what they were trying to, and how nature was operating. Instead, it was this back and forth of give and take about who was right and who was wrong, and of course, each side was protecting their opinion. But eventually, this that 19-year cycle that was shown on which was the Alexandrian methodology was accepted. It was explained in the West by a number of commentators, and eventually it was accepted. And so that produced this common sense of, well, we're going to use the best we have at the time. But then it became all too apparent that was beginning to fail. So when when the reform came for the Pope by Pope Gregory the 13th, all of the sense of the scholarship and the mindset was still in terms of a development of those norms of the Paschalion in terms of that computus. And so here, again, just to highlight that, just to say, he talks about the Holy Fathers and the Ecumenical Council, the spring equinox and the 14th of the moon, again. And this is where this is at odds with that, I believe, the so-called Chrysostom commentary, where he says, which either falls on the day of the equinox itself, or it next succeeds it. And, of course, we can go back to those biblical, I keep saying biblical, those patristic commentators, and they're working out. The system is being worked out. And so it's very incorrect when certain arguments are made on the basis of, well, look, see what this father is saying here. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can go wrong there. It may be a case, too, where it was a more casual comment, and it may have been a misunderstanding. It may have been a faulty textual transmission also. So there's just so much that can go, that has to be looked at before one can make a really strong scholarly argument, I think. Anyway, again, the Lord's Day and the 14th of the moon, Council of Nicaea, spring equinox. He's hitting all the high points here. Epax, something that figures in as the age of the moon, as it carries over from one year to the next. The golden number, okay. And he doesn't want the equinox to recede from when it was at the time of the council, and because he wants to follow present custom. So he's not being a maverick here at all in terms of what he wants to accomplish. And he's going to change it because he wants to keep the habit with which we are now accustomed. He doesn't want to upset the apple cart here for folks. They are used to doing a calculation to get the little different the tables in the West than the one that was shown by Archbishop Job, but it's the same sense. And so he doesn't want to upset any of that. He wants a continuity. According to the ancient use of the church, and again, golden numbers, Paschal tables, just as before, the sacred date of Pascha. Okay, so he's being very reverent, and to stop the 28-year cycle of Sundays. Let me just go back. So here's the here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. Each category has 4 days. That's the 28. So he is finding it necessary that you have to stop that, and his terminology in this is one of volumos. We wish this to be the case. So that's just a quick overview of the Gregorian reform and what it did, and what this is just meant to be, again, a visual example that just as that table was presented for the old Paschalion, well, here's the one for the new. And again, it's indexed by this called the Metonic cycle, 19 years. So here's those 19. I put golden numbers up there. He just says a year. Well, this particular individual who prepared this, I had to go into the Wayback Machine to get it. Some of these good things just have gone away, have disappeared off the web. But anyway, it's arranged in the same ways. It's a table, and the difference here, and what was done in the Gregorian reform, because remember I said that if only that the old table had worked for a while. I mean, it's beautiful, so compact. It didn't work. So what is happening here is that we need to, every 200-year interval, select a different table that again produces the correct, but it looks the same. It has the look and feel of the old system. And that was one of the reasons why it was preserved. And of course, what happens is, again, you can't have it both ways, because then the Gregorian reform is criticized sometimes as, well, it could have been better. It could have been a lot better. And those who did it were aware of that to some extent, but they wanted to keep a familiarity for a number of reasons. But one of the things, for one thing, sometimes it was just practical. Some people said that by the time of the council, going back to the Julian calendar, the equinox had already slipped from the 25th to the 21st, and so you'll find arguments that at the one of those Orthodox meetings in the 1920s, one of the Serbian scientists was arguing, or afterwards commentated, that the Gregorian reform was wrong because the Pope should have moved everything back to the 25th. Well, one of the reasons why some individuals leaders were happy that didn't happen was that many of the books that had already been printed with regard to the liturgical calendar did not have to be changed, because all that was done was that a correction was made, but the sense of the year and the pacing stayed the same. So, not to be nice to go into more details on many of these things, but just to summarize, and I want to do it in a case here where they're considered together, because really I think it's legitimate to say that the real reform of the Julian calendar was accomplished in the Gregorian calendar. And so the moon model facts for these two calendars. Well, for the solar part, it's important to realize that the calendar is constructed to keep the equinox on the 21st of March. So sometimes you read in the literature that so-and-so's equinox occurred on such and such a date, and so-and-so, well, the equinox is occurring for everybody at the same time. It's a matter of, well, what's on your calendar. And if your calendar is correct, then and constructed, that equinox, at least for the Gregorian and Julian calendars, it's meant to be kept on the 21st of March, because that's a given, because all the rest of the calculations and the figuring and the computers is going to be based on the fact that you have corrected this right to be in accord with nature. Well, the Julian calendar year is the 365 days plus one extra leap day every 4 years. And so that gives on the average 365 and a quarter days, or in decimal form like that. The Gregorian year is the 365 plus one extra leap year, just like but every 4 years, just as the Julian, less 3 days every 400 years. A very small correction, but if you work that out, it's the Julian number minus 0.03 over 4. That's 3 over every 400 years, 365.2425. So this is approximating the solar year versus that number. Very small difference very small numerical difference here that makes a big difference in terms of drifting. Now, for both the Julian and Gregorian computus and calendars, they use some form of the Metonic cycle. This was a Greek mathematician, BC mathematician. He figured out this 19-year cycle, such that 12 years of 12 months and 7 of 13, 235 lunations, cycle of the moon. And then later on, this Calippic cycle was discovered, where now you multiply the Metonic cycle by 4, but then you take a day out. And that's kind of like, what's done with the leap year correction. So because you're trying, and that is, 9, for the 4 years, 4 Metonic cycles, 940. Well, that's just that number of lunations, but missing a day. And the whole point of this is to try to match the lunar to the solar. You want the lunar cycle to, after some time and with corrections, to match up with the solar, so that you can then base your calculation on that. And again, that solar cycle is keeping everything fixed properly. Again, just to reiterate, it's very important to keep it on March 21st. When that is done, for the lunar part, for both the Julian and Gregorian, these things are limits. They're very strict, and the ancient or the early writers were very, very strict about this, and sometimes they had preconceived notions about where these things should occur to be correct. And this is sort of going in the opposite direction, which is to say, now we have set up our calendar in our computers. They're correct, they're close, and now for that computers, we can tell you because we know when the moons are going to occur, that the earliest new moon is March 8th, and that's Luna 1. The latest it can be would be the 5th of April, and then adding 13 to get 14 inclusive, so we want that 14th day, because that's the determinator as to whether or not it's going to be the vernal moon or not. And the earliest Luna 14 can be March 21st. Well, that puts it right on the equinox. That's, let me go back. Okay, that's this prescription from the bull. Yeah, fall on the day of the equinox or the next. So this is saying it can form on the equinox. That's okay. Then the next day would be the 22nd. That's a Sunday. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. The earliest Luna 14 can be, when the earliest Luna 14 is the 21st, a Saturday, then the earliest Pascha, Easter, can be March 22nd. Then 35 days inclusive, it could be any of those 35. Then the latest Luna 14 is when it's 18 April on a Sunday, which gets pushed to the next Sunday, 7 days, or the latest being April 25. So if you accept this construct of the computus and what are considered the classical or traditional limits, then these are the dates that limiting dates for Pascha or for Easter. Well, I also mentioned algorithms as part of the computus phase, and here are two of them, one for the Julian and one for the Gregorian, and I'm intending to go through here and you find some very common elements that stand out, 19 for instance, but these are untested, and I'm not quite sure how they work, but it's interesting that this is the equivalent of those tables for both the Julian and Gregorian that we saw. To summarize then, I'm maintaining that the Nicaean, Alexandrian, Roman, patristic, medieval, computus, Pascalian, 4th to the 6th century, and used presently, traditional wording of the Nicene norm, it represents the traditional norming or wording for the determination of Pascha Easter, and is expressed in Inter Gravissimus, the papal bull. And so the Gregorian reform culminates this phase, this Nicaea to Renaissance phase. Well, how good was that revision? And it's been termed an international standard, the Gregorian calendar. If you read it here, just from Wikipedia, I've used a lot of their material and want to give them credit. De facto international standard, used almost everywhere. There is a lunar aspect, and that should be something stressed, that both the Julian and the Gregorian don't just calculate that 1 month or 2 months for Easter. It's meant to be a lunar calendar, which was very important for the ancient times, for navigation and many other travel, to know when the moon would be full, and so we take it for granted, but it was very important. In the Western Church, at least, at one of the service of Prime, first service, I think in the papal bull, the Pope Gregory mentions it too, that the day of the moon should be announced every day so that everyone would know it. There are only 4 countries that have not adopted the Gregorian calendar as at least a civil calendar. Others maintain their own also. And this international standard of representation times and dates uses the Gregorian calendar. And so it's one of those things where really there's, for all the diversity and differences, not just diversity, but differences in the world, that in some way we are united in this civil calendar, which is the Gregorian calendar, and which was constructed with the resurrection in mind. And just to show you also how good it is for the lunar cycle, here is the table from the Aleppo document, where the calculations that were done back in 1977, I believe, in Shambesi, and published in the 80s, which we'll take a look at later. They did a comparison, and of these 25 years, the only one where the Gregorian doesn't match up with the astronomical. And by the way, it's a comparison we're comparing 2 models there. It's important to remember that. But there's only one time that it doesn't match up, and you can see one of the reasons why is when you hit these close calls where the vernal moon actually occurred on the 21st. Split-second timing could make a difference, and that difference can be propagated as a month or at least a week usually. And also, just to point out that in the Aleppo, there's a typo, and it's an important one, because 2025 is where we're talking about the observance of the common date, and it says here 20 May, and it actually means meant to be 20 April. And so this is just to summarize and compare that there's this similarity between the Julian computus. They both use the Metonic cycle, and a small difference in the representation of the leap year. And we'll take a closer look at that. But we've finished now this second phase, the computus phase. And the next is to move on to theology and modern technology. And the first part of this presentation is going to stop here because I was running to longer times. And Jack very graciously suggested that I just split it up. And this has already lasted longer than I was anticipating. However, I want to end on a more profound note. And I found this wording, and of course it's referring to something totally different. It's from Vladimir Lossky's Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church. And in chapter 10, but the words just seem to fit so well. He talks about the way of union. And of course, when you look at chapter 10, I'm looking at it over here. The first words are the deification or theosis of the creature. Well, we're not talking about anything quite that profound here, but the concepts seem to match so nice that when ardor slackens, resolution falters, and grace remains inactive. The evangelical precept to watch demands the full consciousness of the human person in an ascent towards perfect union. This ascent is composed of 2 stages, or more exactly, it is achieved simultaneously on 2 different but closely related levels, that of action, praxis, and that of contemplation, theoria. And I think that sometimes it's nice to consider things in terms of those 2 categories, and it's nice to have the good theories and what we want ideally to be the case, but then we need to put them into real action that makes a difference. The next talk will be theology, but with the emphasis on modern modern technology, and I hope you will return for that.